Hi, you're here sewing with coding, and this quick little video, I want to go over the types of needles that I use the most. And there's really only two. So let's take a closer look and see the two needles that I buy the 100 packs because that's how often I use it. And since they're really the only two needles I use, that's all I pretty much use. So I can easily justify buying a 100 pack of those two types of needles. So let's take a closer look. As always, if you enjoy the video, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel so more people can see the videos, and it's just a better way to help support the channel. All right, let's look. So there are two different types of needles that I use the most. And that's mainly because of the type of sewing that I do and the type of fabrics that I deal with. So the fabrics that I'm dealing with are quilting grade 100% cotton fabrics. So with these fabrics, they're a medium to lightweight fabric. They are a woven fabric, they are a cotton fabric, and so that's why I'm using the two needles that I'm about to mention. So the needle that I use the most for pretty much anything is going to be a Microtex 8012. So the Microtex is a nice sharp needle. It's a fine needle, so it's not a really bulky needle. And the 8012 is a beautiful universal size. It's not too thin where it's going to struggle to go through fabric and kind of bend at higher speeds, which can cause other issues. But it's definitely not too thick to mess up any of the woven 100% cotton fabric that I'm sewing with. It just gives just a beautiful stitch. So whenever you're working with woven fabrics, you're going to want to stick with a sharp needle. Not one that necessarily has a sharp point that's fresh, but a class of a needle that falls in the sharp class, or the sharp category, which is what the Microtex falls into. Because it's just going to give you a prettier stitch. So anytime I'm sewing, garments that's 100% cotton woven, or if I'm piecing quilts, the 8012 Microtex needle is all I need. It's perfect. If I was working with something significantly thicker, then I could go up to a larger size, or if I'm working with something that's really delicate, I could go to a 75. But there's no need, not for what I work with. So usually when people are looking for just a great sewing needle when working with cotton fabrics, an 8012 Microtex is what I usually recommend. We go through them like crazy. So the second needle that I use the most is a 9014 TopStitch. So why a TopStitch? So a TopStitch needle falls in that sharp category just like the Microtex. So it's perfect for the type of fabrics that I work with. But the beauty of a TopStitch needle is the eyelet is 2 millimeters long. So you can look at the Microtex needle and you can look at the TopStitch needle. And that needle, the eyelet where the thread's going through, that hole is significantly longer on a TopStitch. It's 2 millimeters. So what that does, it allows for a number of things. So first I'm using a 914, and this is a needle I use for quilting and for embroidering. So this is quilting on the Q20, Q24, Q16, or on the domestic machine. It doesn't matter. That's the needle size I'm using. I'm using a TopStitch needle because it has that longer eyelet, so it allows for the thread to pass through it much more easily without shredding or breaking. It also allows for a thicker thread to flow through it. Because sometimes when I'm working with like a 12 weight glamour thread by Wonderfill, amazing thread, super pretty, it's 12 weight, so it's really thick. So I'll use a size 100 TopStitch. And so that eyelet is really big, really thick, and that's the only one that can really accommodate that significantly thick thread. But back to the 914. So the 914 TopStitch, so that's a nice strong needle. So when you're forcing that fabric underneath the machine as you're doing free motion quilting, you want something that's thicker of a needle because that needle can bend quite easily. So you don't want something that's going to bend too easy that it's going to strike the foot, or especially it's going to strike the stitch plate which you'll be using, which is typically a 0 millimeter straight stitch plate when you do it in free motion quilting and embroidery. And when it comes to embroidery, why I like the 914 so much is because typically, like if we're doing anything that's thick anything that's got multiple layers of fabric or stabilizer or thread, that 914 can really hold up to that thickness, especially at those high speeds. It's not going to wiggle around and bend on you. But with it being thicker, it's also stronger. So especially if you're doing any type of embroidery in the hoop, any of those projects where you're adding layers upon layers of fabric, layers upon layers of stabilizer, you want something that's nice and strong and that's nice and sharp. And so the 914 fits that category perfectly. And that's why I have the 100 pack of 914. So when I'm working with embroidery or quilting, I've got my needs met on both ends. So if I'm ever sewing with knits, yeah, I would not use either one of these needles. If it's a thin leather, you could use a TopStitch 914, but there is a leather needle, which can easily slice through that hide much easier. Yeah, there are many, many different needles, and we can go over them all, but I wanted to have a video going over the two that I use almost exclusively, mainly for the type of projects and fabric that I'm working with. So I want to show you on your machine how you can get a better visual with these needles. So what we're going to do, we're going to take a closer look at the screen of the 770, but this is the same for all the Berninas, the 4, the new 5 series, the 7, and even the 880. The screen, the user interface is the same, and what we're going to look at is the needle reminder. So let's take a closer look at how we can tell the machine what needle we're working with, just so we can easily remember it, but it also gives you a visual, and that's what I want to show you, how you can really see on the screen the shape and size of the needles. So let's take a closer look. So here we're looking at the screen of the Bernina 770, but like I mentioned before, this is the same user interface for all the current model Bernina machines. So what we can do, the machine has the ability to help us remind us what needle we have in it. The machine could care less, it really could, but it's just there to help us remind us what we're working with. So what we can do, we can come right here, where it shows a picture of the needle, and 9mm and a little stitch plate. So we'll click that one. And so you'll come to this screen here. So here's where you're going to tell it what type of needle you're working with. If you're working with a twin needle, a wing needle, a triple needle, or if you're working with a different type of stitch plate, you can tell it. And these are your security settings, so the machine will put any parameters in place to prevent from breaking the needle or whatnot. But what we're looking at is the button at the top right-hand corner with the little needle and the little bow tie. So we click this. This is our needle reminder. So with the needle reminder, what you're basically doing is you're telling the machine what needle you put in and what size. And the machine's going to remember. So if you ever question like, oh, what needle do I have in the machine? You're always going to know. Because typically it's the next week or the next day that we come to the machine that we forgot what needle is in it, especially if you're working with a lot of different needles. So what you can do, you can scroll through them until you find the type of needle you're working with. So we'll scroll through and look at the Microtex, which is this one right here. So it gives you a little description. So it says the Microtex is a very slim, acute, and it has an acute point. So you can see here, so a little eyelet, and then the point of the Microtex needle is nice and sharp. So here we can tell it work with an 8012 Microtex, which is what I had told it already, because we can see that little white line around the Microtex and the sides. But what I really want to show you is I really want to show you our TopStitch needle. So here we can see our TopStitch needle. It has a very long eyelet, and we can see that here. So both the TopStitch and the Metafill have a nice 2mm long eyelet. You can compare it here to the embroidery needle. So you can really see the size of that eyelet. So this is a neat little area in the machine where you can get a little close-up visual of the type of needle you're working with, and they're pretty accurate in their shape. And we'll just tell it what size needle and what type of needle we're working with, and that is just for us. It's kind of like having a little sticky note of what needle we put in, because remember, the machine doesn't care what needle we have in the machine. All right, well, that's pretty much it. That wraps up the video with my 2 favorite needles and why I buy them in the 100 pack, because they are what I use the most. Everybody sews something different, So you may need to adjust the size or the type of needle you're working with to accommodate your fabric, because needles are very, very important. It's very important that you change your needle often. It's usually recommended between 4 to 8 hours of sewing. You need to change your needle. I have definitely found that smaller needles wear out significantly quicker. They tend to dull relatively quickly, opposed to a larger needle like a 90 or a 100. It's just more metal there to hold up. One of the two biggest factors that are indicators that your needle is getting dull or something's wrong with it is as it's sewing, and every time the needle comes down into your fabric, it may pop. That's an easy indicator that the tip of that needle is broken off. You may not be able to see it, but you definitely should be able to hear it. Another one is skipping stitches. Skip stitches is typically a needle issue, unless it's continuously skipping stitches and looping, then and you've changed your needle, then clearly that's something else. But a random skip stitch here or there, or a loop, especially in embroidery, that's usually an indicator that your needle needs to be changed. All right, well, remember, if you like the video, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel so you can see more content, and as always, happy sewing.